Hello and welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about the intellectual history behind Piketty's work. So Piketty's research agenda, which is focused on the role of capital in market economies, and in particular the predicted expansion of capital over time, really goes back to Karl Marx's work in the 1830s. The reason Piketty calls his book Capital in the 21st Century is really as a reference to Karl Marx's main treatise, Das Kapital. Now, what Karl Marx believed was that the fundamental force driving all of history and economics throughout time was the interplay between capital and labor. Marx believed that an inevitable consequence of market economies was that the stock of capital would grow over time, and as a result, capitalists, which is to say the owners of machinery and other productive implements, would claim a larger and larger share of economic output as history progressed. As a result of that, he expected that people who worked for a living, laborers, would be crowded into a smaller and smaller number of tasks and occupations and get a smaller and smaller share of total economic output. As a result of that, all of the various differentiations and characteristics of people over time will get flattened throughout history into two big class distinctions, where on the one hand we're going to have proletarians, who are laborers, all of whom are going to be completely miserable, have no savings, have no assets whatsoever, and capitalists, who are living off of the fruits of this ever-accumulating capital. So essentially what Marx believed, right, is that whereas in the short term, distinctions between, dentists and laborers might be really important, over time, people who are skilled workers or people who own a small amount of capital are either going to get pushed up into this category of capitalists or down into this category of proletarians. And the inevitable end of this process is essentially the robot apocalypse. Essentially what he believed is that the future of capitalism would end when machinery and robots and capital had taken over every productive task in society. We would have a tiny number of people who owned everything, who would be unbelievably wealthy. Everyone else would be utterly destitute. And then we would eventually have a revolution leading to a robot utopia where all of these destitute proletarians take control of this machinery that can produce everything we want, and we all lounge around in our hammocks reading poetry to each other and feeling very happy. So it's important to note, right, this is a theory that comes out of the mid-19th century at a time when the Industrial Revolution was really just kicking off, and you had tremendous and growing inequality, right? In the industrial cities in Europe and in England during this time period, you have some people becoming incredibly wealthy off of industrialization, whereas the average wages of workers was really pretty stagnant throughout the early 1800s and might have been lower than the wages that rural workers were getting in the Middle Ages prior to industrialization. So in a lot of ways, there's a lot of justification for Marx's theory based on what he was able to observe at the time. In other ways, it's kind of a crazy theory, right, to come out of the 1830s because we did not have a robot apocalypse level of technology this time, right? Essentially, he's looking at a semi-automatic spinning wheel and absolutely freaking out. But the important thing to note here is that Marx makes a couple of really specific predictions, right? The first prediction here is that the share of the total economic output that's going to capitalists or capital should be continually expanding over time. Right? Essentially, the amount of total GDP or total world output that is paid out in wages should be shrinking. The amount of total world output that's being paid out in rents or profits should be continually increasing. The other is that economic inequality should be continually expanding, right? We should see the world population separate into proletarians in the one case who are getting poorer and poorer and poorer and seeing their wages compress more and more and more, and capitalists who are getting richer and richer and richer. So in the early 20th century, an American economist named Simon Kuznets started collecting data about US economic output and total US wages that could be used to actually test this theory. So Kuznets wanted to know, among other things, are these two facts true? On the one hand, is it true that the share of economic output that is being paid out to capital is continually increasing? And on the other hand, is it true that inequality is continually increasing with economic development? Essentially, are we heading towards this Marxist apocalypse or not? And what he found when he looked at data from the first half of the 20th century is that neither of these predictions appeared to be true. So first of all, as you can see in this graph here, the fraction of total economic output that's being paid out to laborers was actually remarkably stable in his data. This data comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, so it's a different data set than Kuznets had access to. But as you can see, if we look at the fraction of the US economy being paid out to labor, it's been incredibly stable at about 2/3 throughout pretty much all of the 20th century. Now, I should say the exact number here depends a lot on how you measure this, but this general trend of stability over time is borne out by lots and lots of different data. So this first big prediction of Marx doesn't appear to be true, right? You don't appear to see that capital is taking an ever-growing share of total economic output. And by the way, Cobb-Douglas production functions became dominant in economic theory because of the fact that they explain this phenomenon, right? Because if you have a Cobb-Douglas production function that uses labor and capital, we would predict that the share of total compensation paid in wages is going to be equal over time and given by the factor share of labor. This has also made its way into Keynes's research, or Keynes's predictions about the future of capitalism, because Keynes believed that as the amount of capital increased among the middle class, it would lead to an inevitable decline in interest rates paid to large fortunes, and what he called the euthanasia of the rentier class. Essentially that as a larger number of people had wealth and were able to produce capital, the returns to capital would fall below the level where it would be possible to simply live off of your assets. Kuznets also found evidence against Marx's other big prediction, that inequality should be increasing continually over time as the capitalist class got a larger and larger share of total economic output, and everyone but capitalists, workers and bourgeoisie, were compressed into an increasingly impoverished proletariat. Instead, what Kuznets found is that while inequality was fairly high in the late 19th century and early 20th century, it fell dramatically and was much lower in the second half of the 20th century. So what this graph is showing you is the percent of total income earned by the top 10% of income earners in each year. So as you can see, the top 10% got between 40 and 45% of economic output prior to 1940, and then got about 35% of economic output after 1940. Now, Kuznets developed a stylized theory explaining this called the Kuznets curve. The idea is essentially that while early technological growth and industrialization might lead to increased inequality because only a handful of people have the skills or the correct placement in society to take advantage of new technologies, as technologies mature, they'll lead to a decrease in inequality as the skills necessary to use the technology and the knowledge of the technology diffuses across society. So essentially, Kuznets argued that the Industrial Revolution might have led to higher inequality in the 19th century than was present in the 18th or 17th centuries, but was leading to lower inequality by the 20th century. And again, this became a broadly accepted and understood part of economic theory, that whereas new technologies or early industrialization might lead to high inequality, we should expect to see lower stable levels of inequality in mature developed economies. Now the problem, and the thing that really motivated Paquette's work, is that in recent years, both of these trends identified by Kuznets don't appear to be holding up anymore. So this first graph is just a zoomed in version of the graph I showed you before, where we're looking at a narrower range in this labor share of economic output, so that I can show you that whereas this share looks fairly stable over the long run of the 20th century, right, at about 2/3 of economic output going to labor, in the last 20 years or so, really starting in the year 2000, we've seen a decline in the labor share of economic output to below 60%. And because of the, while at first this was seen as something of an anomaly, this lower labor share of economic output is persistent enough now to lead to a lot of debate about why this is happening. With some people arguing that it's really an accounting issue, it's about what we're counting as labor income and what we're counting as capital income. Other people arguing that it's a result of technological change. Essentially that as we've developed computer technology and other new technologies, we're seeing this anomalously low share of labor as we're adopting these new technologies. Essentially, we can think of this as being at the beginning of a new Kuznets curve. And likewise, if we look at the trajectory of inequality starting in the 1980s, we're going to see that this top 10%, this share of income earned by the top 10%, stopped being stable at about 1980 and has been steadily increasing ever since. So that now we've got a similar level of inequality as we did in its peak in the early 1900s. Again, right, traditional economic theory or traditional explanations for this might focus on changes in the tax code that started in 1980, or again might think about this new technological wave that we're riding, that we're at the beginning of a new Kuznets curve. But all of this is focused on trying to understand why the last couple decades have been such an anomaly in economic history relative to the rest of the 20th century. Now, Piketty takes a different perspective on these anomalous last couple of decades. Essentially, he argues that these last few decades might not be the anomaly. Instead, it might be the mid-20th century when we saw relatively low inequality and relatively high labor and stable labor shares of economic output that were truly anomalous relative to the whole history of industrialization and market capitalism. What Piketty did is essentially to construct a data set that allows him to measure the labor share of economic output and the distribution of wealth by decile or among higher and low wealth individuals across several European countries and to a lesser extent the United States over a much longer time frame than was available to earlier researchers. And by doing this, he comes to very different conclusions. Essentially what he's going to argue is that if we look at the share of income going to capital versus labor, going back to the 1820s, we can see that, in fact, the share of labor income was not stable over this entire time period and was much lower in the mid-1800s than it was later, right? Than it was in the early 1900s, or certainly than it was in the mid-1900s. So he's going to argue that rather than looking at this and saying that we have a relatively stable labor share up until it starts to dip in the 2000s, we should really look at this as we reach this unnaturally high or unusually high labor share of economic output in the mid-20th century, whereas we had much lower labor share that was sometimes increasing and sometimes decreasing prior to the 20th century. Likewise, when he looks at the share of wealth that goes to the top 10% of households and the top 1% of households, he shows that high inequality in wealth was the norm up until the early 1900s. And that this slight uptick in wealth inequality that we've seen recently might be seen as a reversion to the upward trend in wealth inequality that was apparent from the data or visible in the data prior to the early 1900s. So what is it that changed in the early 1900s? Why is it that the 20th century is such an anomaly? Essentially what Piketty argues is that the two world wars and the Great Depression interrupted the natural processes that were occurring in market economies prior to this point. And so all of the data that we've looked at before, Kuznets' data and the data that economists have relied on afterwards who have taken Kuznets' predictions for granted, are really just telling us about this strange period where the economy was in recovery from the destruction of this very, very unusual few years.